with individuals, but then we move on to organizational bodies, because that in effect, organization, what is it other than people working and moving in unison together? So that's the other part of what we'll be doing. So we're in this book, and I'm just going to quickly put in the chat. Do you all need me to show my screen when I do a contextualized context here? Because you have it. We're on chapter, and I wanted to, because the time was off and everything like that, I'm going to really make our time work for us. I'm going to sort of expedite things so I don't keep you longer than normal, because I can certainly go into the extended version of all of this. Can anybody put in the chat, do you need me to share the screen for this text, Booker T. Washington in Africa, or do you all have it open and ready to go? Can I see it in the chat, folks? Write to me in the chat. Okay, so I'll share my screen, I'll show it. Now, you do know that all of these readings are in WhatsApp, right? They are in WhatsApp. And I actually shared 1, 2, 2, 4, 3, 5, and 6. Okay, which is a big chunk of the book. So I shared chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, and 6. Okay, so it is chapter 4 that I actually didn't touch on. I said I would briefly get into that because it dealt with the transformation that Washington goes through. That I think here we have an aversion. We're so, particularly in the United States, we're so I'm not saying sensitive in the sense that oversensitive, but in the United States, we're the African person, the Black person is under such consistent attack that we almost cannot discuss our issues, and we generally have no privacy here to discuss our issues. I see we're on YouTube Live. That's a perfect example, right? So where do African people have private conversations? However, that being the case, then we still have to just go ahead and discuss how one transforms oneself, right? When we see people make shifts and changes ideologically, meaning allowing themselves to be used by white supremacy and culture, and they make that shift, whether it being used is by being hyper materialistic, exploitative, or engaging in ideologies that don't originate with us, which could be chauvinism, misogyny, feminism, distorted, in those ways. When we allow those ideologies to pass through us and come to the realization that they don't serve us, we should talk about how we made those transformations so that it can be instructive. But typically what happens with us, because of the fact that we are so sensitive and we have a sort of tradition of secrecy as far as discussing our issues, both culturally and then in the society at large, the younger generation generally can't benefit from those transformative moments, those revelations, the full transformation as a whole, because we cannot discuss them for fear of how they're going to be weaponized against us collectively. But this is why we've got to do work in terms of, across a generation, so those conversations can happen. Because then what happens is that one person's transformation cannot be beneficial to a group of people, and then even more the masses, right? If it is not shared. And that is part of what we experience very often here. And so what I'm doing in this book with Washington is really openly discussing his transformation, uh, not to how he was radicalized, because he actually behind the scenes is already the holder of a certain ideology, meaning thought and practice. It's just hidden. Okay. Uh, so he didn't, so he needed more development, but not a complete transformation. However, he does undergo a catastrophic moment, and that is chapter 4, where he is overzealous, overly, he's overzealous, he's eager, he's living vicariously through his students, and he allows himself to agree to Tuskegee graduates engaging in a experiment, a cotton experiment, not a human one, a cotton experiment where students go to, where students end up going to, not students, I'm sorry, where the graduates end up going to Togo in West Africa to engage in an experiment in cotton production. However, the biggest problem is it's in conjunction with the German colonial regime. And this is always problematic because you cannot pair up with imperialists and colonists and think that you could get them not to be exploitative to the people and that you're going to go there and do some good in some way, shape, or form. This ends up being, and I'm just telling you the story instead of reading about it, but I will reference it. This ends up being the biggest catastrophe probably of his life, maybe. And the reason why I say that is because there is a human loss. There's a major human loss, and Washington loses, or should I say, each of the graduates that go to Togo lose their lives. All of them, eventually. So they all die prematurely as a result of something that they were not used to. But the most dynamic of them, who actually ends up staying the longest and or living the longest and starting a industrial school, a vocational school, he ends up drowning while crossing a river. And so, it becomes a big tragedy. Now, I'm an African person. I'm writing this story. I also have some insight. I am a Tuskegee alumni. However, there's another book called Alabama in Africa by Zimmerman. And he tells the story from a very different perspective because he is European. This expedition where Tuskegee graduates would go to the Togo and engage in cotton methods would, one, be the first time such a thing was done, but two, would be only to the benefit of the German colonial regime. And we have to remember what the bare bones understanding and objective of Pan-Africanism is. That is the purpose, unification for the purpose of eradicating oppression wherever we are, right? Sounds much like what you're doing with I Love Black People, because it is, right? And so we unify for the purpose of eradicating oppression and exploitation. We don't unify, work with people in order to oppress and exploit. And certainly the German colonial regime were poised to do that. All the strides made in cotton production that would come out of the Togo expedition would be to the credit of the German colonial forces and Germany itself. Therefore, not to the benefit of any African at all, and not to the benefit of Tuskegee. I don't know. Am I cutting off the top of my head? I'm not so focused on the image, but I just want to make sure that I guess you guys can see me, even though I'm going to be reading for a moment. So let me just put chapter 4 in context. So in this chapter is one of the transformative moments because Booker T. Washington has to press reset on his view. He can't have this attitude that he has to engage the African continent under any means, by any means. Yes, there are specific circumstances and context through which we should establish relationships between Africans in the diaspora and Africans on the continent. It cannot be under the auspices of white agendas or white institutions, exploitative agendas, exploitative institutions, then or now, and think that there will be some good to it. Now, you can fool people for a while, but if you come across people who know how to weigh and measure who benefits more, or weigh and measure the sufferings of our people when we come in contact with the West, who has sent an agent to do their bidding, an agent that looks like us, then you will still get the analysis in the end that this is not good for African people or Black people. Because then ultimately, at the end of the day, when you weigh it, you will see that we are harmed, hurting, exploited, oppressed, marginalized in this situation. So, Washington has to become critical of this. And he becomes critical and aware of this through the experience. I always say there's two types of people in the world: people who can be told something and people who have to experience it. There's an African proverb that says, those who cannot hear, feel. So in this instance, he had to feel, right? Nobody could have told him, don't send your graduates to Africa. He probably would have said, I certainly want to have my graduates on the African continent doing work, making strides, sharing methods that come from Tuskegee. No problem. But the circumstances under which you do them, the people you are in collusion with in order to do that are important. And it's important to have an understanding of that, right? This is how I think African people around the world, we get hurt so much because we get caught up with what things might appear to be and not what things are, right? So this on the African continent, we have a president in any given country looks like they're going to do the right thing for people. And certainly, they're African, and right, we are the same. So we're thinking that there's going to be, productive exchange policies that are advancing the interests of the people. And then something to the contrary happens. Well, that brings us back to weighing, measuring the outcomes. Once again, right? If the outcomes are not beneficial to us, then that person or that entity or that organization did not serve us and serve our interest. And so this is a lesson that Washington learns himself. However, I start chapter 4 off with a conglomerate of things, because Washington is not only involved in the Togo expedition, I discussed it because it's one of the most well-known scenarios, even though it has been misinterpreted by a white scholar. And I'm on the other side of that conversation with my work, because the loss of life to me is the ultimate, and I don't excuse it for anyone, right? I don't excuse loss of life as like, okay, we forge ahead and that's it. I think that is the ultimate loss, right? Loss of life. As Malcolm said, your life is all you have. You don't give it away. So the reality is that although Zimmerman interprets it as, not a catastrophe, someone like myself who is a humanist, and I theorize that way, could only look at the Togo expedition as a catastrophe. And some of it has everything to do with the fact that the circumstances weren't right and that Washington was in fact overzealous and did work in conjunction with the German colonial forces in order to do that. However, this experience takes what are only a small or infantile or parochial understanding of how we have to move in the world as Africans and just catapults him to a whole nother level. Right? Part of the reason, and this is the last time I'm going to make this point, but I think it's important for me and myself, others to say this, because I think we're so surrounded by people who say the contrary. I'm telling the story of a one individual's transformation, ideological transformation, how he comes from point A of no consciousness, just ponderings, to point B, acting on those ponderings, having a method to act on those ponderings and relationships. So in other words, establishing a connection to Africa, going the wrong way in terms of not understanding how to qualify the interactions and the circumstances, having a catastrophic experience that causes great transformation, and coming out on the other side in a space or position where he is able to negotiate on behalf of African people globally on two specific cases. Okay, that's and it becomes, and it is beneficial. The first case is the Liberian Crisis, where he negotiates the fate of Liberia out of this scenario where the French, British, and to a degree the German colonial forces are looking to seize the territory that is now known as Liberia. Washington is the key negotiator and is able to secure a deal. It's not the best deal, but it's the deal that allows Liberia to live, to survive another day and fight in the future, right? So live to survive and fight another day, as opposed to be annexed at that moment in time and have no existence thereafter. So that's the first case. And then the last case is the African exclusion measure. For those of you on here who are African people, Black people who have come to the United States from any of the four corners of the world, this is the case that allows that to happen, the African exclusion measure. And it certainly was propelled by Booker T. Washington. And he, in effect, challenges the US government and forces them to eliminate some unfair legislation, not even simply unfair, but some legislation that racist legislation that would have locked out anyone of the Black or African race, was designed to lock out anyone of the Black or African race from the United States from 1915 on. And it once again is Booker T. Washington who challenges this policy and in effect is successful. So the only reason why later on Marcus Garvey could come, later on the mother of or the grandfather of Malcolm X can come, the reason why Barack Obama's father could come into the United States would be because of Booker T. Washington. And anyone else who comes from any part of the world, the Caribbean, Central, South America, and the African continent, would be the beneficiaries of his victory over this racist measure. But I'm going back to chapter 4. That is the transformational moment. Okay. And that moment is the moment where he has a great fall. And my point that I was going to say, which was my practice in terms of writing this, was, you know, we can't claim the victories if we're unwilling to talk about the failures. Right? So I had to be truthful. We can't claim the victories if we don't talk about the failure. Right? Because they are in contrast to each other. So in order to talk about the trajectory, right? So when someone goes from point A to the top of the mountain in terms of the ideological transformation, and the top of the mountain being the high point when our people benefit the most from what that person is doing. Okay, that's what I'm describing as a high point. If we don't talk about that journey, that transformation, regardless of our vulnerabilities in this society, if we know what we're doing, what we're talking about, and why we're talking about it, it should be a problem. Because we're looking to show that contrast, and it becomes prescriptive to younger people who largely are going to be waging the struggle and continuously in struggle right around the world. We don't have that much longer to struggle along the whole racial thing, because we're going to get this under control, meaning that just numerically, we have good possibility of having victory for our people. I'll leave it at that. But the reality is that it becomes, instructional. It becomes prescriptive when we look at the lives of people who actually did have contradictions and made a transformation. And I can't emphasize that anymore. That I subscribe to that belief, and I know that the old guard of intellectuals, they don't, but that's okay too. We don't always have to agree about things. There's a reason why nature produces people constantly, right? Because new people represent new ideas, and that's important in this world. So chapter 4, and I'm going to switch to share my screen momentarily, but chapter 4, Booker T. Washington, African Affairs and his African National Affiliates, covers a lot of things. On most of the chapter, he is in the right track, Booker T. Washington, and with the exception of the Togo expedition, right? And I've belabored that point. But other than that, he is exploring this idea of back to Africa. And so mass expatriation. And that's what, Liberia would be. He's exploring, he's challenging the atrocities in the Congo. I don't know if anybody from the Congo is on here today. I know sometimes we have people. He, at the time, is part of the Friends of the Congo, which is an organization that still exists today. Brother Al DC is currently a president, have been the president for quite a while, and is very progressive. But Booker T. Washington was the vice president of this Friends of the Congo. And he was propagandizing against the atrocities that were committed by King Leopold and his regime in the Congo. That being said, he would also talk about, like I said, back to Africa, Henry McNeill Turner, who exposed him to it. And more importantly, in the latter part of the chapter, he is communicating with a network, which is important, this dialectical relationship between African people on the continent, African people in the diaspora, African people wherever we are in the diasporas, right? And so he is communicating, for example, this is a great network that he was a part of. He is communicating with someone named Duzay Muhammad Ali, who is actually an actor and many other things, but he's very political. And he's a journalist and a publisher, and he publishes a paper called the African Times and Orient Review. He's born in Egypt, but he resides in Nigeria. And he too is in contact with Marcus Garvey and is communicating with Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington, and Duzay Muhammad Ali all together. This is significant because Duzay Muhammad Ali is in this network with these two other African people, and they are distributing information. He has Duzay Muhammad Ali, the African Times and Orient Review, but he also is working with Marcus Garvey in distributing none other than the Negro World, the leading paper really through the African world. It single-handedly is responsible for organizing the African world under the Universal Negro Improvement Association. That's a very important point. Primarily because of the simple fact that never before or after has the African world been so organized under one organization. And so this network of Jose Muhammad Ali, Booker T. Washington, and Marcus Garvey is part of the dialectical relationship that we are creating here, that we are still having in the world. And really, in the hardest of times, those are the most important relationships because it allows us to forge unity and collaborate. And it shouldn't be confused. Unity is our greatest weapon in a hostile society, in a hostile world. It's primarily why you're in the organization that you're in. You recognize, either consciously or unconsciously, that to work in unison is to work in unison with each other. Okay. Why would you? Oh, okay. You will get a chance. I don't know how this mode of lecturing is not that good. We should be having opportunities to use the microphones to ask questions. No, you do ask questions. You have to talk to the moderator about that. You do have to talk to the moderator about that anyway, but I'm not gonna, there's other people on here, so I'm gonna skip the flow. Yes, I'm going to show you and screen share. So the point, what I'm saying is that in chapter 4, you should have read, notice that the latter part of it is about the relationships that are forged between African people on the continent. So Garvey is in Jamaica. Jose Muhammad Ali comes from Egypt and is based in Nigeria. And Booker T. Washington is in the United States, and they're all collaborating with the same objectives in mind: to protect African people from racism, the exploitation, and the oppressive expressions of it. So this is very important, and actually these kind of relationships, what we're doing, continue that tradition. I'm going to open up the beginning. I'm going to open up quoting the beginning of chapter 4, and then I'll go right to the directed reading and share the screen. My interest in the race. So this is a quote that opens up the chapter. This is Booker T. Washington talking about why he's involved in the Congo Free State, why he's writing about it, why he's giving his opinion about it, why he's trying to influence the situation. So he says, my interest in the race to which I belong and in the advancement of the cause of humanity, regardless of race, is my excuse for discussing a subject which I have not hitherto called attention to in public print. The oppression of the colored race in any one part of the world means sooner or later the oppression of the same race elsewhere. No one who has followed conditions as they have developed in what is called the Congo Free State in Africa can fail to reach the conclusion that there is something wrong, a wrong so widespread that civilized nations cannot escape their duty nor evade their responsibility. And what he's talking about is essentially the killing and the maiming and the abuse of African people in the Congo Free State under King Leopold. And Washington continuously propagandizes. I'm going to close my camera for a second so I can prompt everything for the share. But he begins to propagandize against the atrocities in the Congo, primarily because of the fact that what King Leopold is doing has reached him. And he believes that everyone should. He is so effective in propagandizing against the atrocities in the Congo that he is contacted by King Leopold's aides, and is invited to Belgium. He says no, which is a good idea, because I don't think that he might have survived if he said yes. But then he also continues propagandizing against the atrocities committed in the Congo by King Leopold. Okay, very important point to know, because at the time, unfortunately, what was going on? The United States, just about 30 years before that, 1880, 1884, is the first nation to affirm King Leopold as the sole owner of the Congo. And if you can just imagine what that means that they agreed that one man could actually be the sole owner of a territory in Africa. And to me, that is ridiculous. Okay. Alex, I have permission to share my screen.
Yes, you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So what I have here are the chapters. This is chapter 4. That was what I was just reading from. I'm going to turn it this way so give you a better view. So there you have it, the quote from Booker T. Washington, right? That I just read. My interest in the race to which I belong to advance the cause of humanity, regardless of race, is my excuse for discussing a subject which I have hitherto called attention to in the public print. So it goes on there. So he wrote this in the cruelty in the Congo country, which is an article, and his first article that he writes about in terms of the Congo. So his consciousness is with Africa. He is aware of what's going on in Africa. He is conscious of what's happening in Africa, and yes, certainly sees himself as one of the children of Africa. He says that in the last chapter we covered, right? All the scattered African people in the world, whether old or new, that we are pretty much bound together. Okay, sorry. So I'm just gonna peruse through. So Booker T. Washington hit on the major points and then just jump to the conclusion, because we're not going to spend a whole bunch of time on this. I just want you to get the major points of this chapter, or of any chapter. And Booker T. Washington and imperialism. So this chapter also deals with that. He essentially is critical of the use of Christianity in order to exploit African people on the continent and around the world, because everywhere we are, we have been thoroughly indoctrinated with a form. I'm not going to get into the whole Christian or religious conversation. However, we must recognize, or we would have to be almost blind not to recognize, that Europeans have overwhelmingly used religion as a weapon against African people. As a famous saying historically that predates us all, the Bible and the gun is how the European got a hold of all the territories in the world. They Christianize the people primarily, and they come with the gun. And we would have to wonder about their own contradiction. If you're holding the Bible, do you really need to hold a gun? But this is how they have colonized the world, with ideology, religious ideology, and with a propensity for violence, the gun. Okay. And there's still a pronounced European propensity for violence. If you all are watching here what's happening in the United States, you know that there was just another massacre here, a mass murder of some Asian people by a white guy. Um, but just to focus on this, I'll start with a little bit. The speech that became known as the Atlanta Compromise established Booker T. Washington as the preeminent African American leader in the US. And those who objected to the accommodation of racist social policies saw the speech as a compromise of the worst kind. So Washington gave this speech and he double talked. This is what he was known to do. But what it does is wrongfully sends a signal to the colonial world that he is in some way, shape, or form open to their dominance, okay, over African people. And that, yes, his willingness to, in the public run, not talk about social and political rights meant that he was acquiescing to white domination. Not really, because the problem with Washington, and this is part of the reason why I write the book about him, is because, or about what he did for African people, is because this man is actually wearing a mask. He's saying one thing in the public realm, but when we look at what he's doing behind the scenes, and this book is about some of those behind the scenes things, he is doing something very different. So let me just give you a broad, overt example. There is a man who they attempted to lynch in the United States during Washington's time. They were threatening his life. They were attempting to lynch him. He gets free and he asks for asylum at Tuskegee because it's a well-known bastion for us, Tuskegee, or sort of asylum. He publicly asks Booker T. Washington to extend him asylum to protect him. And Washington publicly says no, and privately arranges for him to get medical care and then brought to Tuskegee. That's what I mean by he wore a mask, right? And we know, I'm not saying this from speculation. I'm somebody who's thoroughly gone through Washington's personal papers, so I'm very clear on like the dual life that he was living, okay, right? So his personal predilections and correspondence and all of that going on when during his time were all released in the 1970s. So this is why people like myself and others can delve into the details of what he actually did. So once again, this speaks to that. While Washington appeared to compromise the social and political aspirations of African Americans, of the African American population in the US, behind closed doors, he quietly wrote the first of two very important articles on colonization in Africa. The first was titled Christianizing Africa. The other was untitled and published by the editor of the Washington Colored American and focused on a return to Africa by the African American population in the US. Washington assumed an anti-imperialist position in both articles. So an anti-colonial position in both articles. Christianizing Africa was published in Our Day, a local Tuskegee paper, in December of 1986. It appears he felt as though it was good a place as any to discuss African affairs and more specifically, the conditions under colonial domination. Washington used the article to deliver a scathing attack on colonial domination in South Africa under the British. Like most European endeavors in Africa at that time, imperialist aims were cloaked in missionary efforts. I'll say that one more time. Like most European endeavors in Africa at the time, imperialist aims were cloaked as missionary efforts, and Washington was particularly critical of this practice. The use of religion to mask imperial objectives. So I'm gonna say it another way, the use of religion to mask colonial and exploitative objectives, right, is what he's detesting. Washington noted was a tactic the British had repeatedly employed all over Africa. According to Washington, what England had done, every Christian nation in Europe had also done. On one ship, a dozen missionaries go to use the Bible, and prayer book in the next ship go 1,000 soldiers to use the rifle. Okay. Can you wonder that the African hesitant? Can we wonder that the African is hesitant about exchanging their religion to that of the Anglo-Saxon race? But that's a direct quote, so that's in his words. The article gave a graphic description of the mass killings of African people by the British and detailed how many were mowed down by the acre with no regard, while African people were killed indiscriminately. Washington stressed that religious justification was well employed because hundreds of prayers were being offered up in as many English churches that God might convert the heathen in Africa and bring them to our way of thinking and acting. What a mockery, he exclaimed. How can a people capable of such widespread brutality and violence over land that they have no natural right to, he asked, act in the name of a better religion? So in other words, he's saying that, in Southern Africa in particular, even in the heart of Africa, you have this contradiction with Europeans, particularly this case, the British, where they are claiming rights to the land, killing African people in Southern Africa, declaring rights and acting as if their prayers to take land from people unjustly, to take and invade other people's homeland, should be remedied with prayers, right? That they're trying to imply that their evil doing is righteous. And so Washington is calling this out in public print, in public press. He is critical of it. And, people are very afraid to criticize people as soon as they invoke religion. You bring God into it, it's supposed to scare other people. This is a tactic that's used time and time again, and it's, always poorly intended because no good intentions are involved in it. It's meant to give people leverage in conversations. God told me to do it. God made me do it. God said this. God said that. And God didn't say any of those things. You said it. I always say, leave God out of this. This is about the evil that men do. Okay. When you're doing wrong, you're not thinking about God. But when you want to justify, you say, God told me to do it. And that's very, I think in and of itself is blasphemous. And that is what Booker T. Washington is talking about. Now, here's the Togo expedition, which is what I started out discussing, how he wrongfully, Washington engages us, even with all the consciousness that he has already, right? He understands that we've got to talk about moving back to Africa, expatriating. He understands the weaponizing of Christianity in Africa and using it again against African people. He recognizes the stealing of the land, and he recognizes the wrong in the atrocities being committed in the Congo Free State under King Leopold and his regime, the Belgians. He recognizes all of that. Still, there's a blind spot because he's got more to go in terms of his ideological development. And yes, what are you all doing here on a Sunday talking about this? We are working on ideological development. Hopefully we all can hear and we don't have to feel. But Washington, maybe he is the type of person who had to have the hard experience. Maybe no one could tell him, or maybe there was no one to tell him. Don't do that. Don't do anything with any colonial power. You're already critical enough to see and know that they do nothing good in Africa. However, whatever it is, and I speculate to some degree about what makes him go ahead and engage in this expedition, and I'll read it briefly. Let me just do a time check. Can I get a time check, Alex? I can't see the time while I'm sharing my screen. So, Alex, can I get a time check? Can you unmute yourself and tell me what time it is? Hello, Alex? Okay. Well, I'm
Well,
just gonna speed it up. Huh?
yeah, sorry, it's 12:56.
It's 12:06?
12:56 p.m.
12:56?
56.
Okay, we
Yes.
started at 11:45. Well, 11:45 for me here. Okay, so all right, so I'm gonna keep it brief because I recognize the comment in there. You want to be able to comment. We typically do that by chat, and then like I said, I'm gonna speed this up so that we have, a good amount of time to do that. However, when I do go back for the Q&A, I scroll all the way back so that I try not to miss any questions. And now, since we're the only ones in here for today, I'm fully aware that all the questions are for me. Normally during the community meeting, I come in at a certain point of the meeting. And so only, so the questions may be for me and may be from the previous meeting. I know all these questions are for me. So just put them in there and I actually go right back. And then we'll talk about in the future, letting people actually use their voice, right? Opening mic unmuting people or allowing people to be unmuted, right? Since this is a smaller group in context than when we're on the community call. Okay, so here we go. The Togo expedition, just in brief, so to give you the formal language. The Togo Cotton Expedition, 1901 was the year Booker T. Washington seized his first opportunity to put Tuskegee graduates on the ground in Africa. From slavery sold around the world, and while he promoted the first Pan-African conference, he accepted an invitation for several Tuskegee graduates to participate in the Togo Cotton Expedition. The expedition was at the behest of German colonial administrators. Washington, although versed on the spread of colonialism throughout the continent of Africa, was unaware of the specific clashes on the ground in Togo. For example, Germany's brutal suppression of the 1896 Dagomba uprising, only a few years before the Tuskegeans arrived in Togo. As indicated by the articles he authored denouncing colonialism in Africa, he was not oblivious to the conditions under imperialism. Unfortunately, his effort to send Tuskegee graduates to Africa can only be described as eager and overzealous. Overzealous meaning like you're too quick, you're too fast, you're moving too fast, right? Overzealous, just you let yourself be overcome by your desire to engage in something that you're not critical enough to see the dangers, the problems, the issues that lie up ahead. While the very questionable objective to boost the German cotton economy was achieved to a degree, the endeavor for Tuskegeans was somewhat tragic. In the end, the experience allowed Washington to acquire intimate knowledge of the conditions in Africa under colonialism. The Tuskegee graduates and one faculty member arrived on the shores of Togo, West Africa, shortly after the turn of the century. Unbeknownst to them, this was a dream Washington was attempting to fulfill. In the story of the Negro, he recalled his time as a student at Hampton. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about the fact that Washington, like I said, is living vicariously through his students. He wanted to go to Africa, so he sends his graduates to Africa when he has the opportunity. And too quickly, for sure. Okay? Too quickly, not critical enough in terms of the circumstances. So in the story of the Negro, he recalled his time as a student at Hampton Institute, where his ambition was to go to Africa as a missionary. He believed he learned something at Hampton that could be particularly helpful to the native Africans. Later, after settling in Tuskegee and assuming his role as the first principal and builder of the institution, his dream of doing work in Africa was dashed. However, he realized that the Tuskegee model and methods could also be useful in Africa. Washington recalled his early aspirations with fondness. So when the opportunity to to send Tuskegee graduates to Togo presented itself, he did not hesitate. Okay. And then it gives you the details, which I'm not going to read here, but he gives you the details of how, how he's co-opted essentially in this scenario. He writes, and this is Washington writing about what he thought it would mean to send the students to the graduates to Togo. I was convinced that I could perhaps be of larger usefulness through the work I was able to do in this country by sending from Tuskegee men and women trained in our methods as teachers and workers among the native people. The request I received through the German embassy was therefore particularly welcome to me, for it gave me an opportunity to realize in a direct way the ambition I had never wholly lost sight of. So he admits here that he has always had a desire. Now, if you remember last week, I talked about the Tuskegee model in Africa. This is a model that he has perfected, and he intends to transport this model to the African continent through the students, through international students who come from the African continent, through domestic students and graduates who are willing to go to the African continent, and through his followers who are essentially disciples of the Tuskegee model, right? Who spread the word, although neither a student or an employee of the institution. So I'm gonna skip ahead and give you the conclusions. That was catastrophic. The Congo Free State is what I told you all already. Washington is propagandizing against the atrocities in the Congo. Now, as those of you who may not know, this is all already in the WhatsApp, right? This was posted 2 weeks ago. I gave you all the readings with exception of chapter 6. So this is all there already. Point being, I'm going to read the conclusion, but and go over those images that you see there. The point is, though, that Washington would then move from having organizational contacts, right, governmental contact, propagandizing in the Black press around what's happening in Africa, condemning Christianity, and having personal relationships with many, many African people, African nationalists on the continent, right? Let me see if I can just briefly. Okay, yeah, I'll read this. So this part of it, of the chapter, really kind of basically gets into Washington's relationships with various people. Dube, right? So I'll run them all down here, but I'll let you all read them on your own if you haven't already read it, even though it's in there for you. And, obviously we want to. Booker T. Washington welcomed African students, African nationalists, and even wrote articles for African publications on the advancement of African people internationally. Subsequently, he encountered John Dube, Isaka Semi of South Africa. Later, he communicated with Duzay Muhammad Ali of Egypt. As documented in his personal papers, he also had indirect influence on other African nationalists, such as Solomon Platt, DDT Jabavu, Casely Hayford, and A. Kirkland Soga. Many of these men became early organizers and founding members of the South African Native National Congress and African National Congress. Most of them initiated contact with Booker T. Washington because of the Tuskegee model and his philosophy of self-reliance and independence. Replicas of the model in Africa were meant to serve as tools of self-reliance and foster some level of independence. Also, replicas of the institution were also to a large degree, an extension of Washington's philosophy, industry for the purpose of independence. The relationship that Washington developed were not one-sided. They were dialectical relationships. So I touched on this a moment ago. Dialectical relationships and essential to his development as a Pan-Africanist. Let me read that again. The relationships that Washington developed were not one-sided. They were dialectical and essential to his development as a Pan-Africanist. The sophistication in African affairs that Washington acquired was due to the details shared by African nationalists who were adept at discussing the nuances of their plight in Africa. In the same way that Marcus Garvey discussed the social, sorry guys, in the same way that, all right, I don't know if that knocked me off. No, stop broadcasting screen now. I don't want to stop. Okay. In the same way, in the same way that Marcus Garvey discussed the social and political circumstances as they existed in Jamaica at the time, John Dube discussed the challenges he faced in South Africa with Washington. The others who primarily wrote and visited from various African countries also shared the state of African affairs in their locales. As we know, Washington also communicated with Pan-Africanists like Henry Sylvester Williams, originally from Trinidad, to John Dube of South Africa and Casely Hayford of the Gold Coast. John Dube became a very important figure in South Africa, so I will leave it there. He was established a school and so on and so forth. But my point in sharing that is to say that these relationships, even like what we're doing now, these relationships, dialectical relationships, us talking back and forth, communicating, sharing information about our condition on the ground, our reality, how we are struggling against racism and xenophobia. These realities are actually not just a one-way thing. The dialectical relationship is beneficial to us both. So while I tell the story of Washington's relationship with Africa and African people, it is wrong to think that they were the only ones benefiting from knowing him because he was internationally known, because he was the elder, he was the senior of between him and most of the individuals he had contact with. No, he is being educated and transformed by them as well. And I can't stress that enough. He is being educated and transformed by these numerous African nationalists in Africa. How else would he know about their condition on the ground? How else would he know their reality? How else would he know their struggles? How else would he have some sense of what would be assisting and what would be hurting or harming them? And these relationships proved to be transformational in his development as a Pan-Africanist. This is all important because he would then engage in two cases where he doesn't have to ask anyone. He already has his signpost set up. He understands how he must move, what he must do for the purpose and the interest of African people. Okay, and those two cases are the Liberian Crisis and the African Exclusion measure that are also in the course and already posted in WhatsApp. So conclusion, as the 20th century approached, Booker T. Washington already had Pan-African sentiment, but lacked actual experience in the African context. His article, Christianizing Africa, was evidence of this anti-colonial stance as well. Simply put, Washington did not endorse the colonization of Africa and the use of Christianity to do so at that point. Further, although he considered expatriation to Africa, having been exposed to Bishop Turner and others, he opposed a return to Africa if it meant domination and colonization of the African population from the U.S. in Africa. The Togo Cotton Expedition was the beginning of a turning point for Booker T. Washington during this period. hold on. Sorry, folks, 1 second. Period in history. He engaged Pan-Africanists who were unified and organized around efforts to eradicate the oppression of African people. However, although he identified the Pan-African Conference as the beginning of a movement, he was unable to apply the guiding principles of the movement. In other words, when confronted with the opportunity to send Tuskegee graduates to Togo upon invitation from German colonists, Washington failed to see or ignored that imperialists in Africa were in fact oppressive forces. Sorry, oppressive forces. Okay, I'll say that again. In other words, when confronted with the opportunity to send Tuskegee graduates to the Togo upon invitation from German colonists, Washington failed to see or ignore that imperialists in Africa were in fact oppressive forces. He separated
Looks like Dr. Tarine dropped off accidentally. Let me try get her back on the call.
Sorry, folks. Sorry about that. A call was coming in and knocked me off of the Zoom and took our page, took me out of the thing. Okay, so I'm back in. All right. My hair is doing some crazy stuff, but okay. So let me get right back to sharing the screen. Okay. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so we try not to skip a beat, but the point is that Washington, in other words, when confronted with the opportunity to send Tuskegee graduates to the Togo upon invitation from German colonists, Washington failed to see or ignore that imperialists in Africa were in fact oppressive forces. He separated opportunity to implement Tuskegee methods from the means of the expedition in Togo. The situation highlighted Washington's contradictions. It's an important point right here. The situation highlighted Washington's contradictions. Contradictions are, and I'm not reading this right now, contradictions are meant to be resolved for us to fully do what we need to do for us as Black people. We can't support African people, Black people, and serve somebody else's interest at the same time. The situation highlighted Washington's contradictions as a developing Pan-Africanist. The series of deaths in Togo marked the expedition and made recruitment of Tuskegee graduates challenging. However, shortly afterwards, he repositioned himself, and when corresponding with a white American investor from the Midwest who wanted to colonize the Negro in Africa, Washington made his position clear. He did not support the colonization of African people anywhere. Andrew Zimmerman, I know this is the author that I was discussing before. Andrew Zimmerman, author of Alabama and Africa, addressed Booker T. Washington as a Pan-Africanist in light of his role in Togo. He used the phrase colonial Pan-Africanism, which marketed the African-American population as an exceptional labor force that could be used in Africa. But that was not Pan-Africanism at all. Pan-Africanism embodied the principle of liberation. It's important to understand in this course, in this particular course where we're studying Pan-African history and organizing. Okay? Pan-Africanism embodies the principle of liberation. Okay? It cannot be oppressive. If it is oppressive, then it is not Pan-Africanism. It's something else, or maybe some other ism, but it's not Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism uniquely embodies the principle of liberation. We unify for the purpose of liberating ourselves from oppression and exploitation. If you don't remember anything else from this course, this is what you should remember. And this is just me giving you one step-by-step case of one person's transformation from being someone who is not conscious of these things to someone who becomes conscious of this through tragedy and then is a stealth fighter in terms of effectiveness in the case of Liberia, in the case of the African exclusion measure. Okay, so Tuskegee's Pan-Africanism embodied the principle of liberation. So Tuskegee's alliance with German colonial forces in Africa is disqualified as an example. Zimmerman clarifies his use of the word in describing both Du Bois and Washington's initial engagement with the international community as ambivalent Pan-Africanism, which he defined as helping to disseminate, even if not endorsing, a colonial variety that would reproduce the New South in Africa, even while simultaneously committed to more radical variants of Pan-Africanism. Later, both Du Bois and Washington moved on to express a more authentic form of Pan-Africanism. These expressions did not compromise the core principle of the philosophy. In other words, both men would go on to hone how they would serve African people as Pan-Africanists, and it would be very different. Whenever Booker T. Washington's relationship with African nationalists Whenever Booker T. Washington's relationship with African nationalists and Pan-Africanists are examined, they are generally limited to the idea that he influenced and inspired them with his philosophy and the Tuskegee model. This is incorrect. Washington was equally influenced by his encounters with and relationships with African nationalists. I already stated this, but this is it in print. Manning Marable also acknowledged that Washington's relationships in Africa extended far beyond colonial administrators to include nationalists. Admitted in his pivotal article, Booker T. Washington and African Nationalists, as much, he wrote, "It would be a mistake to consider Washington's influence on the modern African mind by simply reviewing his direct association with colonial administrators or his friendship with capitalist enterprises. An astounding amount of correspondence of Washington, his executive secretary, Emmett Scott, and his advisor, sociologist, Professor Robert Parks, with Black nationalists implies Tuskegee's guarded support for Black militant endeavors. As much as they may have been true, Washington was equally influenced and educated by these very Pan-Africanists. African and Black nationalists. They were dialectical relationships, not one-dimensional, flat and one-sided. Everyone involved learned something valuable regarding the complexity of the struggle at home in Africa and abroad. These are some of the individuals that Washington was engaging. Dusay Muhammad Ali, who I mentioned before, the Egyptian-born, right, in Nigeria residing editor and founder of the African Times and Orient Review. He was a mentor and distributor of Marcus Garvey's Negro World as well. This was John Chilembwe of Mali. He actually would strike the first blow in Africa for liberation in terms of, just in the same way here, there is someone who struck the first blow in terms of violence to say that the Civil War, that the end of slavery would not come like butter. It would come with fire. It would come with blood. We would spill some blood to end the institution of enslavement in the United States. When I say we, I'm talking about my African ancestors. I'm not talking about the white Americans, right? Africans would be willing to spill some blood to liberate ourselves. But just in the same way, on the African continent, you had John Chilembwe and his wife, said to be followers of Booker T. Washington in Malawi. He would actually engage in a struggle against the colonial forces and engage in what would be considered, a massacre or insurrection. John Tango Jabavu and Son of South Africa, 1903. He would also be in contact with Washington. So he's one of the people whose correspondence is there as well. Then you had Pixley Ka Sakasimi. He is also of South Africa and one of the individuals Washington is communicating with. And then, of course, we have some of you may know, J.E. Casely Hayford, John Casely Hayford of the Gold Coast. He is from present day Ghana, right? Ghana used to be called the Gold Coast. He attended the first International Conference of the Negro in 1912. The conference I discussed before, that I said that there would be people coming all over the African world to learn about Tuskegee and its practices and take them back to their native lands. John L. Dube of South Africa. Dube would come to the United States. He would visit Tuskegee and he would also meet Washington as well. And all of these individuals that you saw in some way, shape, or form would implement and adopt some of the practices of Tuskegee and some of the philosophy of Washington in terms of this idea of independence through industry, right? Kicking Europeans out and becoming sustainable, right? Sustaining ourselves as African people and unifying in our efforts to sustain ourselves, because we understand that unity is our armor. I'm going to leave it there because I definitely have gone over, and I obviously know, I recognize that some of you wanted to jump in the conversation. I'll move a little faster next week since I know that we've got the time issue sort of cleared up at this point. I'm going to do the Q&A. Okay, I don't see anybody in the Q&A. And I guess we lost. All right, we lost a lot of people in the last thing. But if there's any questions, let's do them now. Are there any questions about what we went over? Any questions? So you guys can read chapter 5 and 6 and we'll cover those. I'll move a little faster next week since I think we got it with the time issue. Any questions? No questions?
I think there was one question from Derry Anthony. I don't know if you got a chance to answer it. He was asking, does it mean that Washington himself never came to Africa?
That's right. He never came to Africa. I can't see any questions. I don't know why. I don't see anything in the chat.
I think it's because you dropped and rejoined, so the chat.
Right. So everything that was in there is gone. Yes.
Mhm.
No, he would never, like Marcus Garvey, he would never make it to Africa. Yes, you're very right. Like Marcus Garvey would never make it to Africa. Any other question? So right now, so this is a good thing. I mean, even though we're stopping, uh, this is a turning point for Washington. So read chapter 5 and 6, and I'll prompt you through the week. This was a hectic week. I had a funeral to go to, this, that, and the other, just a lot of running around, so I don't prompt as much. But this week I'll be sure to jump in and kind of massage you through the readings. So that when we go into next week, I will just summarize those 2 important cases. And now you'll know so much that you'll understand why he's positioned this way. Nobody becomes a precise fighter for our people without some development, okay? Without ideological development. What goes into the making of someone like that, who so effectively serves us at the moment in time where they need to serve us and when they're in position to serve us, right? Most of us, when we're in position, we don't got the consciousness. And when we're not in position, we have the consciousness. Seldom are people in the position and have the consciousness all at one time and the opportunity. And these are 2 moments, the Liberian Crisis and the African Exclusion Measure, are 2 moments where Washington is in position and has the consciousness because of all these things that I told you about at this moment in time when these situations come up. Do you think him never making it to Africa was more of his own personal decision or world decision? I think it was circumstantial. I think he does have the opportunity to go to Africa, as you'll see if you read the Liberian Crisis case. But he is wedded by this time to this baby that he has made called Tuskegee Institute, and he dare not leave it. Not 4,000, not put 4,000 miles between him and it. He's very often in a place called New York, which I'm from. He's very often in New York conducting business for the sustaining of Tuskegee. However, to go 4,000 miles away, and you remember, there's no telephones. You're not going to just be calling back and forth. You can send correspondence and telegrams, as you know, because he's communicating with people on the continent. But they're writing letters, and they would be diligent about this, but he would never. Once he begins to raise this thing called Tuskegee and give it back to the people in 1893, with establishing it as its own institution, an institution that belongs to the people, he dare not leave it. So he is like Marcus Garvey in many ways, someone who would actually consciously do things for African people who were actually on the continent and scattered abroad, but never make it to the continent of Africa himself, right? Even though he writes extensively about wanting to go to Africa, wanting to work in Africa, not really being a religious person, but only knowing, only understanding that missionaries go to Africa. So he wanted to be a missionary, not because of the religious path it presented, but because it would put him on the African continent. But if you want to know all about Washington's ideas, views, beliefs about Africa and his connection, there's a book called, more important than my book, called The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race of Slavery, from Slavery. He attempts to tell the story of us as a people from at home, which is Africa, first Africa as home, to the United States, and through, not stuck in, but through the institution of slavery. Right? So it's called The Story of the Negro, The Rise of the Race from Slavery. Yeah, so he's attempting to tell our story of survival and victory over enslavement, but from our journey from home. If anybody was confused about who Washington was or who he thought he was, when he's not referring to America as home. He's talking about Africa as home. Where did he get that consciousness from? You know, some of us don't have that consciousness out here in the West today. We're not calling Africa home, we're calling America home. Okay. Even though America will tell you over and again, it's not your home. Okay. You know, and don't get comfortable, not even after 400 years. So, you know, not to get into the whole American thing, but my point is that here is an African person in the United States who way back when in 1900 was writing a book where he is referring to Africa as home. And the ideological development that preceded that, we'll never truly know. I have an idea. I talk about it in chapter 2, but the reality is that he had that type of consciousness. Okay, that needed to be developed. It wasn't flawless, but it needed to be developed, and ultimately, that is how he comes out on the other side of this particular chapter. And I'm kind of glad that I singled this chapter out because it's important to you know, I'm assuming most of you all are my age or younger, and it's very important that we, from the previous generations, we take what we can get from them. We let them pass on what we can get from them, but then the rest of it, we create a new practices and strategies that are useful to us. And why am I highlighting that? I'm highlighting that to say that it's important. Once again, I started this lecture with talking about transformation. You can't engage in ideological development without understanding that you'll be transformed by it. Okay. And that should be to our benefit. To talk about where someone was at point A and how they got to point B is something that is almost taboo in the space that I'm in the context here, because we feel collectively so vulnerable and attacked and by white supremacy and culture and the establishment, that we don't talk about how we got from point A to B. So I'm returning to my original commentary in the beginning, which is that we have to talk about these transformational moments. We have to talk about these transformations of people who may not be serving us in the best way and make a transformation to serving us in the best way. How does that happen? That is instruction for younger generations that are struggling with some of the same things. So I guess to a large extent, I'm a new or a different and hopefully a more progressive type of scholar and intellectual in terms of talking about our struggle. Because what I'm saying is in spite of, we do all the other stuff with other guys watching, right? This is on YouTube. I didn't know we were going to be on YouTube today, but we do all the other stuff with everybody else watching. Fine. Let them see us transform, because you're not going to be able to change it. Ideological development and transformation takes place inside, right? It changes this, and then we act it out. So there's really nothing anybody can do to stop it. So let them watch. Let them see what you're doing. Fine. We can't stop it. Everything is open and out there now anyway, right? Meaning that there are no spaces that are only our own. That being said, if you're truly committed to the transformation, ideological transformation, doing the work to develop yourself, to put you in a position to be the most effective for African people, then you're not worried about who's watching. And we don't allow the old guard to say to us, hey, don't share notes on how to transform. This is what you all are doing in the context of I Love Black People. You are undergoing, and we get far deeper than this. You are undergoing a process of ideological development for the purpose of being the most effective at being an ambassador for I Love Black People. That's what you're doing. You know, so whether you fight with a pen or in paper or in other ways, no fighter for their people does that work without ideological development. Simple as that. And I think I'm going to leave it there. So chapter 4, we looked at Washington's transformation, how he goes from point A to B and becomes well positioned in order to execute the final cases that we'll discuss in there about the African exclusion measure and the Liberian crisis, which are critical cases. And to be quite frank, both of the cases produced policy changes that we both benefit from, today. And yes, Liberia is a complicated situation, but I do think that Washington was on the right side of it. He is one of the many players in that story that helped Liberia survive to see another day. And that's very important because African independence is important, particularly for the two African nations that had never been colonized. All right, so it was important for them to stay independent and free, and that was Liberia and Ethiopia. Right, never colonized by any imperialist nation. So I think I'm going to stop there. If there's no other questions or comments, we're going to get this together, though. I think, look, like I said, it's so sad that we have to do this time change stuff, and it impacts how we get together, but we're going to get back on track. Okay. If there are no other questions, I'm going to sign out. Okay. All righty. I am